So let's now start talking about the hijunka, which can be translated as leveled out workload. If you ask yourself what would be the types of wastes that exist out there, normally most of people would know about the mudas, the 7 mudas, which is the wastes. And normally, if you only focus on those 7 forms of Muda, that will lead to unpleasant consequences. Yes, they are going to give you some marginal benefits because they are the most obvious, but they will not serve you. Attacking them will not serve you on the long run, okay? Because there are the other 2 M's, the Mura and Mori, are just as important, and the 3 of them should fit together. The Mori, Mura and Muda should fit together in order for the system to function, in order for the waste elimination to happen. And focusing only on one of them will not lead to the optimum results that we're looking for. So most of us would know about Muda, but let's review it together. Muda means waste, which is what we can say anything that doesn't add value to the customer. Or we can, in another way, we can say things that if we take out of the process, our customer will at least be equally satisfied. And there are 7 common types of mudas or types of waste that they are out there, and they are most commonly used in order to attack the Muda. And these 7 can be summarized in the 10 mood acronym. So transportation, inventory, motion, and waiting, and overproduction, overprocessing, and defects. And if you focus on eliminating those 7 kinds of wastes, it will help you improve the operating efficiency to some degree, by a large margin, but to some degree. So what those 7 mudas are? So let's take them one by one. So the first is waste of overproduction. Waste of overproduction. When you produce more than necessary or earlier than necessary, this is called overproduction. And the second one is the waste of time on hand. So if you notice a machine that is idle, this is a kind of waiting. If you notice a worker who is idle, this is also a kind of waiting. That this kind of waiting we need to reduce or eliminate. The third is waste in transportation. So if the transportation doesn't add value to the process itself or to the product or service that we're delivering, so in this case it cannot be considered as value, and this transportation should be considered as waste. So people moving around inside the factory, equipment moving around inside the factory without bringing the product closer to the customer or without doing a kind of processing on it. So this cannot be considered as transportation. It cannot be considered as a value-added activity. The fourth one is the waste of processing itself, right? So we can say, in another term, it can be called the overprocessing. So it means if we do more than necessary in terms of processing, so in this case it could be highlighted as excess processing. So if I need only 4 steps and I do 5, in this case I'm doing overprocessing. If I'm doing a kind of inspection which is not necessary or required by the customer, so again this is case as an added step, it can be called an overprocessing. An extra unnecessary signature required by your line manager to do a specific transaction, again, this is a kind of over processing. The other, or the fifth kind of waste, is the waste of stock on hand or inventory. And if you produce more than necessary or earlier than necessary, it will give you, or it will lead eventually to having waste or stock on hand. And we all know that any kind of stock is subject to obsolescence, is subject to misuse, will require some resources for it to be managed, and so on and so forth. And basically the customer doesn't care how much of inventory you already have, as long as he receives his products or services on time and in full, right? The other kind of waste is movement. And movement, when we talk about movement, we talk about the movement of people. So when people are moving around inside the factory, or doing or moving his hand or his body parts in order to do a kind of assembly or kind of processing. So the movement itself is not considered as a value-added activity, but as long as he makes a transformation on the product or service, in this case we can consider it as value-added. But just, for example, just approaching the tool or approaching the part in order to do some processing on it is not a value-added process, and it should be eliminated or at least minimized. So the last of the 7 kinds of wastes is the waste of making defective products, which is having either defective products or scrap products, or products that will need to be reprocessed or handled or remanufactured. So these 7 kinds of waste are the most common when we talk about Muda, and again they can be summarized in 10 moods. So transportation, inventory, motion, and then waiting, overproduction, overprocessing, and defects. Another 8th kind of waste is called the waste of talent or unutilized talent, but again this is an added one, and it's also common in some textbooks as well. And it talks basically that it considered basically that we should include people who are really close to the value-added process in any kind of improvement activity or any kind of any new intellectual ideas about improving our customer service or our products. So the second M, so we mentioned the Muda, and there are the 7 of them, and the 10 Mood acronym. Now the second one is Mori, and if we consider that Muda is underperforming, we should consider Mori as the overperforming, which is basically means overburdening people or equipment beyond the natural limits. Okay, so which will lead eventually to, for example, safety issues, quality problems, or even breakdowns in machine. And so if you overburden people, if you overburden equipment, that will lead again in some kinds of Muda, and or even worse, health and safety issues. So the third component of the 3 M's is the Mura, which means evenness, which is the opposite of Hajunka or the leveled out workload. So imagine that for a day your workload is, for example, 4 hours of worth of time, and the second day is 10 hours, the third day is 3 hours, the fourth day is 5 hours, and so on and so forth. So you have high level of unevenness, and low level of leveling or low level of hijunka. If you plan your resources that for this schedule that you will have, for example, 5 hours of workload, so you in some days you will find that workload is less, so people will not do anything, so there will be Muda. And for other days we will need to force people to work harder and faster and more and faster, so that they can catch up with the higher demand on the other days, which will lead to Mori, right? So it basically, in sometimes we'll have some too little work to do and overburden on other times. So if you only focus on Muda, as we just highlighted, if you only focus on Muda, you can, yes, spot the 7 wastes, but it will not help you finding the right causes of the Muda. So in order to tackle the root causes of the Muda, you have to work on unevenness, because as we just highlighted, Mura will lead to overburden, Muri, in some days or in some circumstances, and Muda on other days. So you have to reach a kind of evenness in your production workload, so that you can tackle the Muri and Muda. So we need to find a way so that we have the 3 components fit together to tackle all different kinds of wastes. So how do we do this? Can we give some training to the supervisors or team leaders or group leaders and ask them, okay, you now know about Muda, you now know about Muri, and you now know about Mura. Do something about it. Make it happen. Can we do it? Of course not, because as it's apparent now, if you have spikes in workload in some days and no workload on other days, this is not at all the job of the supervisors or group leaders or team leaders or team members. Basically, it's very clear this is the job of management. So management is responsible for taking care of Mura, so that the unevenness is minimized, and this will help the other team members at lower levels to tackle the other kinds of wastes. I think that is clear by now. So again, focusing only on Muda will lead to idle workers on some day, overburdened workers on some days, equipment breakdown, which will lead to waiting, for example, lower productivity, because as we knew, in some days people will be idle, and eventually unhappy customers. Because if you have unhappy people, you will have unhappy customers. If you have unhealthy equipment status, you will have unhappy customers. If you are having lower productivity, you will have higher cost, which will lead to unhappy customers. So in order for you to satisfy your customer needs and on the same time to fulfill the purpose of the business, you have to tackle the 3 M's together.